between a vapor barrier and an air barrier?
Ooh, good question. Okay, so I'll reference the Ontario Building Code with this just because that's where we're building. So the Ontario Building Code references air barrier, vapor barrier, and weather barrier. So weather barrier is kind of self-explanatory. It's usually the tie-back or the tie-par that goes on the outside of the house. That's your weather barrier. Weather barrier. So in our climate where we build here, normally what's done is that you have a 2x6 wall, you have your weather barrier on the outside. Now they're starting to put exterior insulation, so like XPS, which is good, which could be used as an air barrier as well. But I don't think they are using it. What they're doing is they're putting the poly, so in your 2x6 wall you have usually fiberglass insulation in where we build the typical home. And then you have poly on the inside of that, which would be your vapor barrier and your air barrier. So there's a little bit of a flaw with this. So the Ontario Building Code says that the air barrier needs to be continuous, but the vapor barrier does not need to be continuous. In theory, to my knowledge, the air barrier is never continuous and never has been continuous in any home, because if it was, when that home did a blower door test, which is when they figure out how airtight your home is, the ACH, which stands for air changes per hour, would be 0. So basically there would be no air leakage in that house, which to my knowledge has never actually been accomplished ever anywhere. So where the flaw is in this is this: if you rely on that 6mm poly as your air barrier and your vapor barrier, you end up having to tape all the joints, and where you have weak points is basically where all your penetrations are. So all of your plugs, any switches, anything that penetrates that into that wall becomes a weak point where it's going to now be air leakage. And if you don't believe me and you're living in one of these homes that are built this way, in the winter when it's colder, go down to one of the plugs on the lower level, put your hand there. Because of the stack effect, you'll just feel all that cold air coming through there, guaranteed. If you're somewhere warmer, I guess you can still do it on a colder night, right? If it's warmer on the upper floors, go down to those plugs on the lower floors, and then you'll feel that air coming in. So, how do we solve this? And really, if you separate them, that's how we can solve it. Or if you put the air barrier somewhere where there's no penetrations, that's how you solve it. And when you take care of the air barrier in one place, you don't have to worry about taping the vapor barrier on the other place. So in our wall assembly, we have our weather barrier on the outside. We actually have a double stud wall. We have on our first wall, that's where we take care of the air barrier, which is a permeable fiberboard. And then on the inside wall, which is kind of like just to hold insulation to put all of our plugs, we take care of the vapor barrier there. And then we can have all the plugs and all the penetrations, not have to worry about having to tape anything, because the Ontario Building Code doesn't require you to have a continuous vapor barrier, just a continuous air barrier, because it makes sense. And you won't have any condensation issues because you've already taken care of the air barrier and you don't have any penetration. So it's that much better of a wall assembly. So vapor, I guess back to the original question, the vapor barrier is really just to keep vapor from inside your house getting into your wall, and the air barrier is to make sure there's no air leakage from inside to outside. And that's the air barrier is the most important part, because that's going to help keep condensation from getting into your condensation or vapor getting into your wall because of what am I trying to say here? The air barrier is the most important part, because that's going to keep any of that condensation from happening through air leakage, because you're going to take care of it. But that's going to make your home more healthier, and because it's tighter, so you won't have all those pollutants coming through your wall, and it's going to be more comfortable because you won't have all that cold air coming through your wall, or hot air if it's in the middle of the summer. So that's where we want to really take care of that. Weather barrier, air barrier, vapor barrier. I could probably go on for another 10 minutes about other ways that you could do this wall assembly, but think of them as different. There is a big difference between air barrier and vapor barrier, so make sure that you understand those differences. Make sure if you're working with a builder or your insulator, make sure they understand the differences, because a lot of them are just doing things because that's the normal way to do it, or that's how they've been taught to do it, but it might not necessarily be the best way to do it. So have those conversations.